Good morning. Hope you're having a great start to your Monday morning. Marathon Monday on Columbus Day doesn't usually happen, but that's what's happening this year. So Nachmanides, one of the greatest Jewish writers, thinkers, has a fascinating question on this week's Torah portion. And he says, the Torah introduces us to so many biblical figures. But throughout all of them, there's only one figure that the Torah doesn't tell us anything about them before introducing them. For example, the Torah tells us about Noach last week. But before God gives us the story about Noach, the Torah tells us a little bit about who Noach was. He was righteous, he was complete, he was holy. Take Moses. God gives Moses the command, and then God tells Noach to go into the Teva, right? First he tells us about him, and then there's the calling to go in. Same thing with Moses. First we hear about Moses growing up in the palace. He was a boy pampered and royalty, so to speak. And then he goes out one day and he sees his brothers being hit, and he stands up for them, and God calls him. And the same is true with Samson. We read about his mother and she's barren, etc., etc. Every single biblical figure we hear about, we get a little bit of introduction to. There's one figure that the Torah tells us about without any introduction, and that's this week's portion. And it might be the most consequential leader, the father of Judaism and monotheism, Abraham. The Torah portion starts off, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, God says to Abraham, Lech lecha, go out of your land to the land that I will send you. Suddenly, God gives Abraham a directive to leave his family. He says, Lech lecha me'artzecha, from your land, from your birthplace, and from your parents' home. El ha'aretz asher areka, to the land that I will send you. But who's Abraham? Why doesn't the Torah introduce us to this powerful man? Why doesn't the Torah tell us something about Abraham before we get introduced to him, so we can understand who this is? I think we're hearing the first runners coming by. In any case, there's many answers, but I'm going to give you an answer from the Gerer Rebbe, the Sfas Emes, which is really powerful. And he says like this. He says the reason that God doesn't introduce Abraham is because really the message of Lech lecha me'artzecha, go from your land, from your comfort zone, to the place that I shall show you, is actually a calling of God to every single one of us. Men, women, children. People always tell me, Rabbi, why don't I get a revelation of God? Well, guess what, says the Sfas Emes? God spoke to you. He said, Lech lecha me'artzecha me'ladetecha me'beis avicha el ha'aretz asher areka. He tells us, leave your homeland, leave your comfort zone, leave your self-centeredness and go to God-centeredness. Find a mission of land instead of focusing on your nature, on your nurture, on where you came from. Go al ha'aretz asher areka. See the promised land, see the vision of Torah, of Judaism, of making this world a better place. And that's what the Gerer Rebbe says is the answer to Nachmanides' great question. God doesn't specifically tell us anything about Abraham before, because really the message of Lech lecha is a call to every single Jew, every single person to travel out, to make this world a better place. I read a remarkable story a couple of years ago, the Chabad rabbi in Be'er Sheva. One day he gets a call from this guy, Yaakov Seltzer. He's 90 years old. He said, I want to come study with you. So the rabbi says, no problem, I'll come to your house. He says, no, my house is not kosher. I can't study in my house. I'll meet you somewhere else. Fine, they start studying a little longer, a couple of weeks, a couple of months. And then one day he tells the rabbi, Rabbi, you could actually come to my house. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, I koshered my house now. Since we last started studying, I realized I want to kosher my house. At 90 years old, Yaakov Seltzer had a bar mitzvah. And then they dedicated a Torah to him. And the Rabbi Heber, looks at this guy and he says, tell me, you got to tell me the secret. What happened at 90 years old that changed you? He said, I'm a Holocaust survivor from Hungary. My parents were pulled away from me and taken to the gas chambers where they were murdered. And I was so angry at God. They were pious, they were observant Jews. And I promised myself I would have nothing to do with Judaism. And that's what happened for the next 70, 80 years. And then one day my neighbor, I lived in Israel, but I had nothing to do with Judaism, with spirituality, with religion. And then one day my neighbor invited me for Shabbos dinner. I couldn't say no, and I went. And I watched a mother light her Shabbos candles. And suddenly it brought me back 80 years earlier to Hungary, to my mother's home, my parents' home, as my mother lit the Shabbos candles. And I was overcome with a sense of spirituality, with a sense of connectedness, with a sense of yearning. And I said, I have to connect to Judaism, and I have to reconnect to my roots. Yaakov Seltzer heard his calling. God called him Lech Lecha. Yes, it was hard. Yes, there's so many questions, but we have to travel. We have to take the road that no one else has taken to make this world a better place. And that's why God tells us. This message is not just to Abraham, it's to every single one of us and you. God bless you. Have a great day. Enjoy the beautiful weather.